1. The Question of Palestine. 1. Palestine and the Palestinians. Until roughly the last 30 years of the 19th century, everything to the east of an imaginary line drawn somewhere between Greece and Turkey was called the Orient. As a designation made in Europe, the Orient for many centuries represented a special mentality, as in the phrase the Oriental mind, and also a set of special cultural, political, and even racial characteristics, in such notions as the Oriental despot, Oriental sensuality, splendor, inscrutability. But mainly the Orient represented a kind of indiscriminate generality for Europe, associated not only with difference and otherness, but with the vast spaces, the undifferentiated masses of mostly colored people, and the romance, exotic locales, and mystery of the marvels of the East. Anyone familiar with the political history of the late Victorian period, however, will know that the vexing, mostly political Eastern question, as it was called, tended then to replace the Orient as a subject of concern. By 1918 it is estimated that European powers were in colonial occupation of about 85% of the globe, of which a large segment belonged to the regions formerly known simply as Oriental. The romance of the Orient was thus succeeded by the problems of dealing with the Orient, first in competition with other European powers maneuvering there and second with the colonial people themselves in their struggles for independence. From being a place out there, the Orient became a place of extraordinarily urgent and precise detail, a place of numerous subdivisions. One of these, the Middle East, survives today as a region of the Orient connoting infinite complexities, problems, conflicts. At its center stands what I shall be calling the question of Palestine. When we refer to a subject, place, or person in the phrase the question of, we imply a number of different things. For example, one concludes a survey of current affairs by saying, and now I come to the question of X. The point here is that X is a matter apart from all the others, and must be dealt with apart. Secondly, the question of is used to refer to some long-standing, particularly intractable and insistent problem, the question of rights, the Eastern question, the question of free speech. Thirdly, and most uncommonly, the question of can be used in such a way as to suggest that the status of the thing referred to in the phrase is uncertain, questionable, unstable, the question of the existence of a Loch Ness monster, for example. The use of the question of in connection with Palestine implies all three types of meaning. Like the Orient of which it is a part, Palestine exists in another world from the habitual Atlantic one. Palestine is also in some way what the most thorny international problem of post-war life is all about, the struggle over, for, and in Palestine, which has absorbed the energies of more people than any other for a comparable period of time. Finally, and this is a main reason for this book, Palestine itself is a much debated, even contested, notion. The very mention of the name on the one hand constitutes for the Palestinian and his partisans an act of important and positive political assertion, and on the other, for the Palestinians' enemies it is an act of equally assertive but much more negative and threatening denial. We need only recall here that demonstrations on the streets of major American cosmopolitan centers during the late 60s and much of the 70s were led by factions saying either Palestine is or there is no Palestine. In Israel today it is the custom officially to refer to the Palestinians as so-called Palestinians, which is a somewhat gentler phrase than Golda Meir's flat assertion in 1969 that the Palestinians did not exist. The fact of the matter is that today Palestine does not exist, except as a memory or, more importantly, as an idea, a political and human experience, and an act of sustained popular will. My subject in this essay will be all those things about Palestine, although I will not for a moment pretend that Palestine, for anyone now living and writing in the West, is not the question of. Yet even to admit that is already to venture into a relatively unfamiliar field. For too many people who read the press, who watch television and listen to the radio, who pretend to more than a smattering of political knowledge, who confess to expert opinions on international controversy, the Middle East is essentially the Arab-Israeli conflict, dispute, problem, struggle, etc., and little more. There is a considerable reductiveness in this view, of course, but what is really wrong with it is that most of the time it literally blocks Palestine from having anything to do with the Middle East of today, which since September 1978 seems entirely symbolized by Munich Begin, Anwar al-Sadat, and Jimmy Carter locked up together at Camp David. A considerable majority of the literature on the Middle East, at least until 1968, gives one the impression that the essence of what goes on in the Middle East is a series of unending wars between a group of Arab countries and Israel. That there had been such an entity as Palestine until 1948, or that Israel's existence, its independence, as the phrase goes, was the result of the eradication of Palestine. Of these truths beyond dispute, most people who follow events in the Middle East are more or less ignorant, or unaware. But what is most important is the continuing avoidance or ignorance of the existence today of about 4 million Muslim and Christian Arabs who are known to themselves and to others as Palestinians. They make up the question of Palestine, and if there is no country called Palestine, it is not because there are no Palestinians. There are, and this essay is an attempt to put their reality before the reader. Much recent history involves the Palestinians, and like their present actuality, it is a history dispersed in likely and unlikely places. No foreign affairs symposium, scholarly book, or moral attitude taken is complete without some reference to Palestinian, sometimes also known as Arab, terrorism. Any self-respecting director planning a film on some current, and probably invented, enormity would not pass up the occasion to introduce a Palestinian into his cast as a sort of card-carrying terrorist. Films like Black Sunday and Sorcerer come immediately to mind. On the other hand, the Palestinians have canonically been associated with all the characteristics of refugees who, depending on the occasion, fester in camps, are a political football being used by Arab states, are a breeding ground for communism, tend to procreate like rabbits, and so forth. More analytic and hard-headed commentators have frequently remarked that the Palestinians constitute an elite in the Arab world. Not only do they seem to have the highest educational attainment of any other national group there, they are also well placed in sensitive positions in sensitive places in the overall Arab polity. Such pressure points as oil ministries and installations in the Arabian Gulf, economic and educational advisories, all these plus a large segment of the Arab upper bourgeoisie, bankers, entrepreneurs, intellectuals, are occupied by Palestinians, all of whom are supposed to be hungry for trouble and revenge. Lastly and most recently, for the first time since 1948, American political debate has turned to the Palestinian problem. Beginning with President Carter, it is no longer considered a sign of rank anti-Semitism to say that Middle Eastern peace must at last take the problem of the Palestinians into serious consideration. A Palestinian homeland and the thorny issue of Palestinian representation at proposed peace conferences are enormously important questions now challenging public consciousness. Because of its first post-1948 appearance as an independent item on the United Nations General Assembly agenda in 1974, embodied in Yasser Arafat's controversial appearance there, the question of Palestine has irritated and penetrated the general awareness in a new and possibly propitious way. Although Palestinian self-determination was first voted on affirmatively at the United Nations in 1969. General Assembly Resolution 2535b expressed grave concern that the denial of Palestinian rights has been aggravated by the reported acts of collective punishment, arbitrary detention, curfews, destruction of houses and property, deportation and other repressive acts against the refugees and other inhabitants of the occupied territories, and then went on to reaffirm the inalienable rights of the people of Palestine. 1 year later, Resolution 2627c recognized that the people of Palestine are entitled to equal rights and self-determination, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Despite these unambiguous determinations, the Palestinians remain so specialized a people as to serve essentially as a synonym for trouble, rootless, mindless, gratuitous trouble. They will not go away as they ought to, they will not accept the fate of other refugees, who have, apparently, simply resigned themselves to being refugees and therefore are contented as such. They cause trouble. Recent crises involving the Palestinians in Lebanon and Jordan are cited as instances to prove the point. And if the commentator happens to be more sophisticated, he may also allude to the fact that the Palestinians are part of what is doubtless a fearsome event, the resurgence of Islam. According to this somewhat paranoiac view, if even the President of the United States refers to the Palestinian problem as an intrinsic part of the Middle East peace, it is because of Muslim oil, Muslim fanaticism, Muslim blackmail. What all such material partially screens is something totally intractable, something that totally resists any theory, any 1+1 explanation, any display of feelings or attitudes. I refer to the plain and irreducible core of the Palestinian experience for the last 100 years, that on the land called Palestine there existed as a huge majority for hundreds of years a largely pastoral, and nevertheless socially, culturally, politically, economically identifiable people whose language and religion were, for a huge majority, Arabic and Islam, respectively. This people, or, if one wishes to deny them any modern conception of themselves as a people, this group of people identified itself with the land it tilled and lived on, poorly or not as irrelevant, the more so after an almost wholly European decision was made to resettle, reconstitute, recapture the land for Jews who were to be brought there from elsewhere. So far as anyone has been able to determine, there has been no example given of any significant Palestinian gesture made to accept this modern reconquest or to accept that Zionism has permanently removed Palestinians from Palestine. Such as it is, the Palestinian actuality is today, was yesterday, and most likely tomorrow will be built upon an act of resistance to this new foreign colonialism. But it is more likely that there will remain the inverse resistance which has characterized Zionism and Israel since the beginning, the refusal to admit, and the consequent denial of, the existence of Palestinian Arabs who are there not simply as an inconvenient nuisance, but as a population with an indissoluble bond with the land. The question of Palestine is therefore the contest between an affirmation and a denial, and it is this prior contest, dating back over 100 years, which animates and makes sense of the current impasse between the Arab states and Israel. The contest has been almost comically uneven from the beginning. Certainly so far as the West is concerned, Palestine has been a place where a relatively advanced, because European, incoming population of Jews has performed miracles of construction and civilizing and has fought brilliantly successful technical wars against what was always portrayed as a dumb, essentially repellent population of uncivilized Arab natives. There is no doubt that the contest in Palestine has been between an advanced, an advancing, culture and a relatively backward, more or less traditional one. But we need to try to understand what the instruments of this contest were, and how they shaped subsequent history so that this history now appears to confirm the validity of the Zionist claims to Palestine, thereby denigrating the Palestinian claims. In other words, we must understand the struggle between Palestinians and Zionism as a struggle between a presence and an interpretation, the former constantly appearing to be overpowered and eradicated by the latter. What was this presence? No matter how backward, uncivilized, and silent they were, the Palestinian Arabs were on the land. Read through any 18th or 19th century account of travels in the Orient, Chateaubriand, Mark Twain, Lamartine, Nerval, Disraeli, and you will find chronicled their accounts of Arab inhabitants on the land of Palestine. According to Israeli sources, in 1822 there were no more than 24,000 Jews in Palestine, less than 10% of the whole, overwhelmingly Arab population. For the most part, it is true, these Arabs were usually described as uninteresting and undeveloped, but at least they were there. Yet almost always, because the land was Palestine and therefore controlled, in the Western mind, not by its present realities and inhabitants but by its glorious, portentous past and the seemingly limitless potential of its, possibly, just as glorious future, Palestine was seen as a place to be possessed anew and reconstructed. Alphonse de Lamartine is a perfect case in point. He visited in 1833 and produced a several hundred-page narrative of his travels, Voyage en Orient. When he published the work, he affixed to it a résumé politique in the form of a series of suggestions to the French government. Although in the voyage proper he had detailed numerous encounters with Arab peasants and town dwellers in the Holy Land, the résumé announced that the territory was not really a country, presumably its inhabitants not real citizens, and therefore a marvelous place for an imperial or colonial project to be undertaken by France. What Lamartine does is to cancel and transcend an actual reality, a group of resident Arabs, by means of a future wish that the land be empty for development by a more deserving power. It is precisely this kind of thinking, almost to the letter, that informed the Zionist slogan formulated by Israel Zainwil for Palestine toward the end of the century, a land without people, for a people without land. For Palestine has always played a special role in the imagination and in the political will of the West, which is where by common agreement modern Zionism also originated. Palestine is a place of causes and pilgrimages. It was the prize of the Crusades, as well as a place whose very name, and the endless historical naming and renaming of the place, has been an issue of doctrinal importance. As I said above, to call the place Palestine and not, say, Israel or Zion is already an act of political will. This in part explains the insistence in much pro-Zionist writing on the dubious assertion that Palestine was used only as an administrative designation in the Roman Empire, and never since, except of course during the British Mandate period after 1922. The point there has been to show that Palestine too is also an interpretation, one with much less continuity and prestige than Israel. But here we see another instance of the same mechanism employed by Lamartine, using a future or past dream to obliterate the realities lying between past and future. The truth is, of course, that if one were to read geographers, historians, philosophers, and poets who wrote in Arabic from the 8th century on, one would find references to Palestine, to say nothing of innumerable references to Palestine in European literature from the Middle Ages to the present. The point may be a small one, but it serves to show how epistemologically the name of, and of course the very presence of bodies, in Palestine are, because Palestine carries so heavy an imaginative and doctrinal freight, transmuted from a reality into a non-reality, from a presence into an absence. My more important point is that so far as the Arab-Palestinian is concerned, the Zionist project for, and conquest of, Palestine was simply the most successful and to date the most protracted of many such European projects since the Middle Ages. I say this as a relatively simple historical statement, without at this stage wishing to say anything about the comparative intrinsic merit of Zionism against that of earlier projects. Palestine became a predominantly Arab and Islamic country by the end of the 7th century. Almost immediately thereafter its boundaries and its characteristics, including its name in Arabic, Falastin, became known to the entire Islamic world, as much for its fertility and beauty as for its religious significance. In the late 10th century, for example, we find this passage in Arabic: Falastin is the westernmost of the provinces of Syria. In its greatest length from Raf to the boundary of Al-Lajan, Legio, it would take a rider 2 days to travel over, and the like time to cross the province in its breadth from Jaffa, to Riha, Jericho. Zugur, Sejer, Zor, and the country of Lot's people, Dire Khan Lot, Al-Jibal, the mountains of Edom, and Ash-Shara as far as Ayla, Al-Jibal and Ash-Shara being 2 separate provinces, but lying contiguous one to the other, are included in Falastin, and belong to its government. Falastin is watered by the rains and the dew. Its trees and its plowed lands do not need artificial irrigation, and it is only in Nablus that you find the running waters applied to this purpose. Falastin is the most fertile of the Syrian provinces. Its capital and largest town is Ar Ramla, but the holy city of Jerusalem comes very near this last in size. In the province of Falastin, despite its small extent, there are about 20 mosques, with pulpits for the Friday prayer. In 1516, Palestine became a province of the Ottoman Empire, but this made it no less fertile, no less Arab or Islamic. A century later the English poet George Sandys spoke of it as a land that flowed with milk and honey, in the midst as it were of the habitable world, and under a temperate clime, adorned with beautiful mountains and luxurious valleys, the rocks producing excellent waters, and no part empty of delight or profit. Such reports persist in profusion through the 18th and 19th centuries, not only in travelers' accounts but, by the end of the 19th century, in scientific quarterly reports published by the British Palestine Exploration Fund. Despite the steady arrival in Palestine of Jewish colonists after 1882, it is important to realize that not until the few weeks immediately preceding the establishment of Israel in the spring of 1948 was there ever anything other than a huge Arab majority. For example, the Jewish population in 1931 was 174,606 against a total of 1,033,314. In 1936, Jewish numbers had gone up to 384,078 and the total to 1,366,692. In 1946 there were 608,225 Jews in a total population of 1,912, 112.7 in all these statistics. Natives were easily distinguishable from the arriving colonists. But who were these natives? All of them spoke Arabic and were mainly Sunni Muslims, although a minority among them were Christians, Druzes, and Shiite Muslims, all of whom spoke Arabic too. Approximately 65% of the Palestinian Arabs were agricultural people who lived in about 500 villages where ground crops as well as fruits and vegetables were grown. The principal Palestinian cities, Nablus, Jerusalem, Nazareth, Acre, Jaffa, Jericho, Ramlah, Hebron, and Haifa, were built in the main by Palestinian Arabs, who continued to live there even after the encroaching Zionist colonies expanded very close to them. There were also a respectable Palestinian intellectual and professional class, the beginnings of small industry, and a highly developed national consciousness. Modern Palestinian social, economic, and cultural life was organized around the same issues of independence and anti-colonialism prevalent in the region. Only for the Palestinians there were the legacy of Ottoman rule, then Zionist colonialism, then British mandatory authority, after World War I, to contend with more or less altogether. All Arab Palestinians, almost without exception, felt themselves to be part of the great Arab awakening stirring since the last years of the 19th century, and it is this feeling that gave encouragement and coherence to an otherwise disruptive modern history. Palestinian writers and intellectuals like Hakim Darwaza, Khalil Sakakini, Khalil Beydas, and Najib Nasser, political organizations like the Fatwa and Najada, the Arab Higher Committees, and the Arab League of Arab National Liberation, which argued that the Palestinian question could only be solved by Arabs and Jews together, all these formed great national blocs among the population, directed the energies of the non-Jewish Palestinian community, created a Palestinian identity opposed equally to British rule and to Jewish colonization, and solidified the Palestinian sense of belonging by whichever continuity of residence to a distinct national group with a language, the Palestinian Arab dialect, and a specific communal sense, threatened particularly by Zionism, of its own. From the beginning of serious Zionist planning for Palestine, that is, roughly, from the period during and after World War I, one can note the increasing prevalence of the idea that Israel was to be built on the ruins of this Arab Palestine. At first the idea was stated with a good deal of circumspection, and it was done to fit in with the conceptions of a reconstructing colonialism so crucial to high European imperialism. In 1895, Theodor Herzl noted in his diaries that something would have to be done about the Palestinian natives. We shall have to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Lord Rothschild corresponded on behalf of the Zionists with the British government in the phase that led up to the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. His memorandum of July 18, 1917 speaks of the principle that Palestine should be reconstituted as the national home for the Jewish people. Chaim Weizmann was soon to speak of the fact that the British understood how the Jews alone were capable of rebuilding Palestine and of giving it a place in the modern family of nations. The Chief Rabbi of England, Dr. J. H. Hers, spoke eloquently of British powerful support to the re-establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. None of these statements is clear enough about what is at present to be found in Palestine. The country's reconstitution and rebuilding unmistakably implies, however, that its present constitution, including hundreds of thousands of Arabs, was to be dissolved. How or where this is to be done isn't very clear, in order that in its place was to appear a new Jewish state. The style of these declarations of intent is to leave out any unambiguous reference to the doubtless inconvenient fact that the country was already constituted, if only as a colony, and that its inhabitants were most unlikely to be happy about their reconstitution by a new colonial force. But the statements themselves are perfectly accurate. Palestine was rebuilt, it was reconstructed, it was re-established. Just how brutal these acts were is indicated, I think, in these remarks by Moshe Dayan in April 1969. We came to this country which was already populated by Arabs, and we are establishing a Hebrew, that is a Jewish state here. In considerable areas of the country, the total area was about 6%, we bought the lands from the Arabs. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I do not blame you, because these geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. Nahalal, Dayan's own village, arose in the place of Mahalol, Gavat, in the place of Jibta, Kibbutz Sarid, in the place of Haniefs, and Kfar Yehoshua, in the place of Tel Shaman. There is not one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. Haaretz, April 4, 1969. Even Dayan's terminology, frank as it is euphemistic. For what he means by the Arab villages are not there either is that they were destroyed systematically. One outraged Israeli, Professor Israel Shahak, who reckons almost 400 villages were thus eliminated, has said that these villages were destroyed completely, with their houses, garden walls, and even cemeteries and tombstones, so that literally a stone does not remain standing, and visitors are passing and being told that it was all desert. There is some unpleasant congruity to the fact that after the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, the same policy of destruction was carried out there. By the end of 1969, 7,554 Arab houses were razed, and by August 1971, 16,212 houses had been demolished, according to the London Sunday Times of June 19, 1977. Nor was this all. According to the most precise calculation yet made, approximately 780,000 Arab Palestinians were dispossessed and displaced in 1948 in order to facilitate the reconstruction and rebuilding of Palestine. These are the Palestinian refugees, who now number well over 2 million. And finally, we should add that the quantity of Arabs held since 1967 inside the occupied territories, which Munachim Begin claims to have liberated, is 1.7 million, of them 500,000 are part of pre-1967 Israel. The transformation of Palestine which resulted in Israel has been an extraordinarily expensive project, especially for the Arab Palestinians. 2. Palestine and the liberal West. All the transformative projects for Palestine, including Zionism, have rationalized the denial of present reality in Palestine with some argument about a higher, or better, more worthy, more modern, more fitting. The comparatives are almost infinite: interest, cause, or mission. These higher things entitle their proponents not only to claim that the natives of Palestine, such as they are not worth considering and therefore non-existent, they also feel entitled to claim that the natives of Palestine, and Palestine itself, have been superseded definitively, transformed completely and beyond recall, and this even while those same natives have been demonstrating exactly the opposite. Here again the Arab Palestinian has been pitted against an undeniably superior antagonist whose consciousness of himself and of the Palestinian is exactly, positionally, superior. Among the many examples of this expressed and demonstrated superiority there is naturally the Balfour Declaration, made in November 1917 by the British government in the form of a letter to Lord Rothschild, who represented Zionist interests for the occasion, in which the government undertook to view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. What is important about the declaration is, first, that it has long formed the juridical basis of Zionist claims to Palestine and, second, and more crucial for our purposes here, that it was a statement whose positional force can only be appreciated when the demographic or human realities of Palestine are kept clearly in mind. That is, the declaration was made a. by a European power, b. about a non-European territory, c. in a flat disregard of both the presence and the wishes of the native majority resident in that territory, and d. it took the form of a promise about the same territory to another foreign group, so that this foreign group might, quite literally, make this territory a national home for the Jewish people. There is not much use today in lamenting such a statement as the Balfour Declaration. It seems more valuable to see it as part of a history, of a style and set of characteristics centrally constituting the question of Palestine as it can be discussed even today. Balfour's statements in the Declaration take for granted the higher right of a colonial power to dispose of a territory as it saw fit. As Balfour himself averred, this was especially true when dealing with such a significant territory as Palestine and with such a momentous idea as the Zionist idea, which saw itself as doing no less than reclaiming a territory promised originally by God to the Jewish people, at the same time as it foresaw an end to the Jewish problem. Balfour himself was quite clear about these matters. Note in the following extract from a memorandum he wrote in August 1919, how as a member of the cabinet he was well aware of the various contradictory promises made to parties in the Middle East theater, and how what finally counted was not any violation of promises, but his, that is, his as a privileged member of a superior political, cultural, and even racial caste, sense of the important priorities, the contradiction between the letter of the Covenant, the Anglo-French Declaration of 1918. Promising the Arabs of former Ottoman colonies that as a reward for supporting the Allies they could have their independence, is even more flagrant in the case of the independent nation of Palestine than in that of the independent nation of Syria. For in Palestine we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, though the American Commission has been going through the forms of asking what they are. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long tradition, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desire and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. In my opinion, that is right. That is, however, no mere expression of an opinion, it was a statement of policy that radically altered the course of history, if not for the whole world, then certainly for the 700,000 Arabs and their descendants whose land was being pronounced upon. Later I shall be discussing the very source of such power in statements like this. Now, however, I want to gloss my earlier remark that the contest has been between an allegedly higher and a humble reality. At roughly the moment that Balfour was writing his memorandum there were facts, and I mean, in this instance, bodies that could be counted, as they were indeed counted by the British census for Palestine in 1922, about which there could be no debate on gross numerical issues, even though the qualitative issues were subject to interpretation. The census, which is the only reliable source for the demographic realities of that time that we have, and which despite its considerable undercounts has also been used consistently by Israeli historians, makes the 1914 population at 689,272 persons, of whom no more, and perhaps less, than 60,000 were Jews. The census further shows that by 1922 some 590,890, 78%, were Muslim, 73,024, 9.6%, were Christian, mostly Arab although some British and other Europeans were included, less than 10,000, 1%, were other, and 83,794, 11%, were Jewish. Of the latter, perhaps two-thirds were European immigrants and their offspring, some having arrived late in the 19th century, others since the inception of British rule. As I said earlier, by the end of World War II the non-Jewish proportion of the population in Palestine was 70%, and of the remaining 30% which made up the Jewish population, 70% were concentrated not on the land, where the desert was supposedly being made to bloom, but in cities and villages. Moreover, British policy made Zionism its beneficiary, demographically speaking. The natural increase in population is normally 1.5% a year, but the Jews in Palestine between 1922 and 1946 were increasing at an average of 9% annually, helped by the British policy of forcing a Jewish majority on the country. In the year 1927 alone, the increase reached the figure of 28.7%, and in 1934 it reached 25.9%. The only way in which these brute, politically manipulated disproportions between natives and non-natives could be made acceptable was by the rationale Balfour used. A superior idea to that of sheer number and presence ought to rule in Palestine, and that idea, Zionism, was the one given legitimacy right up until 1948 and after. For their part, the Zionists clearly saw themselves as the beneficiaries of this view. Far from the Arab multitudes signifying an already inhabited land, to the early Zionist colonists these people were to be ignored. Different reasons were given, most of them built on an assumption essentially identical with Balfour's. A recent book about the Israelis, written by an Israeli, has described the blindness of the early and mid-20th century settlers in Palestine, without making the connection back to Balfour and the moral epistemology of imperialism. This blindness was as true of left-wing ideologues and movements like B.R. Borochov and Hapol Hazer as it was of so-called romantic right-wingers like Vladimir Jabotinsky and his revisionists, Menachem Begin's political ancestors. At bottom, as Amos Elon has quite accurately shown, the Zionists considered the Arab problem as something either to be avoided completely or denied, and hence attacked completely. There is no separating Balfour's ideology from that of Zionism, even though Zionist Jews perforce had a different feeling for, a different history and historical experience of, ideas about Palestine. For all their differences, and they were numerous, both the British imperialist and the Zionist vision are united in playing down and even cancelling out the Arabs in Palestine as somehow secondary and negligible. Both raise the moral importance of the visions very far above the mere presence of natives on a piece of immensely significant territory. And both visions, as we shall see in Chapter 2, belong fundamentally to the ethos of a European mission civilisatrice, 19th century, colonialist, racist even, built on notions about the inequality of men, races, and civilizations, an inequality allowing the most extreme forms of self-aggrandizing projections, and the most extreme forms of punitive discipline toward the unfortunate natives whose existence, paradoxically, was denied. I shall have something to say about Zionist projections and discipline as they bore on the Palestinian natives later in the book. Now I want principally to remark that for much of its modern history, Palestine and its native people have been subject to denials of a very rigorous sort. For in order to mitigate the presence of large numbers of natives on a desired land, the Zionists convinced themselves that these natives did not exist, then made it possible for them to exist only in the most rarefied forms. First denial, then blocking, shrinking, silencing, hemming in. This is an enormously complex policy, for it includes not only the policy of the Zionists toward the native Arabs, but also the policy of Israel toward its Arab colonies, and the character of the Israeli occupying forces on the West Bank and Gaza after 1967. These two are matters that will occupy me later in this book. However, it would seem more interesting to inquire here why these aspects of the Palestinian experience are so little known and discussed in the West. Here we find ourselves confronting some special attributes of the Zionist-Palestinian interaction. If, as I have been saying, Palestine was the site of a contest between a native presence and an incoming, basically European Western form of advanced culture, then it has followed that a considerable part of the contest was conducted outside Palestine itself. Before 1918, Palestine was a province within the Ottoman Empire. After 1918, it officially entered Britain's sphere of influence. As far as the Jewish minority in Palestine was concerned, Zionism had very little to do with them. Despite the worldwide interest among Jews in the Balfour Declaration, no publicity was undertaken for it in Palestine, in the Jewish community there. This fact was in keeping with the spirit, if not the letter, of Balfour's view that the present inhabitants need not be consulted, even though these present inhabitants happened also to include some Jews. Later, during testimony given to the Supreme War Council preparing for the Paris Peace Conference, Sylvain Lévy, a distinguished French Orientalist, the profession is important for the argument of this book, spoke on behalf of the Zionist delegation. He argued that, though the work of the Zionists was of great significance from the moral point of view, Palestine was a small and poor land with a population of 600,000 Arabs, and the incoming Jews, having a higher standard of living, would tend to dispossess them. According to Weizmann, this embarrassed the Zionists since, as he was later to say, the world would judge the Jewish state, and presumably the Zionist movement, by what it shall do with the Arabs. For indeed it was the world that made the success of Zionism possible, and it was Zionism's sense of the world as supporter and audience that played a considerable practical role in the struggle for Palestine. Not all the world had Balfour's callous disregard of natives, although it is also true that during the late 19th and early 20th centuries even anti-imperialists like John Hobson believed in the existence of subject races whose opinions did not count very high on a list of priorities. Nevertheless, the Zionists and even the British knew that somehow the natives would appear, and by appear I mean something little more than that the natives would become physically perceptible, if nothing else, to observers, and by appearing would make their resistance known to the world. It was not lost on the British and the Zionists that according to the finest Arab study of the struggle for independence, the Arab Awakening by George Antonius, the Arab Renaissance would make Arabs aware of the impossible contradiction between their plans for themselves and for their territory, including Palestine, of course, and the plans advanced by Balfour, the Zionists, and the French. Moreover, most of the Jews of the world, then as now, were not in Palestine but in the world, defined as the European-American world. The task then became to convert Palestine into a Jewish state, without at the same time making it possible for the world to take seriously, or even later to know about, the natives' protest. The systematic denial of a substantial native Arab presence in Palestine was accompanied, as I said above, by its destruction, blocking, and confinement in Palestine, and its blocking and confinement in the councils of the world. In addition, the Zionists were able to diffuse their views and their reality over the views and reality of the Palestinian Arabs. A negative project, denial and blocking, entailed an equal and opposite positive project, diffusion. I am not speaking here about mere propaganda, which, were it to have depended principally upon lies about Palestine, would never have brought Zionism to its realization in Israel. What concerns me a great deal more is the strength of the process of diffusion whose main focus was the Zionist colonization of Palestine, its successes, its feats, its remarkable institutions, just as today the strength of Israeli information is its admiring self-regard and the celebration of its pioneering spirit, which Americans in particular have found it very easy to identify with. An intrinsic aspect of diffusive strength has been a systematic repression of the Arab reality in Palestine. Most accounts of the kibbutz, for example, leave out the facts that even before the State of Israel came into being, and of course after, Arabs were never admitted as members, that cheap, Arab or Oriental Jewish, hired labor is essential to kibbutz functioning, that socialist kibbutzim were and are established on land confiscated from Arabs. Rather than attempt in advance to answer the charges that might be made about Zionist policy toward the Arab natives in Palestine, Zionist spokesmen simply said nothing about them. In the case of the kibbutz, therefore, the institution appeared to grow and prosper more or less spontaneously in an uninhabited land, where enterprising Jewish immigrants hit upon the otherwise quite remarkable social unit which was the kibbutz. And so it went in Palestine with such instruments as avoda ivrit, Jewish labor, whose purpose, according to Amos Elon, was aimed at the establishment of a completely separate economic sector for the newcomers, the Jewish arrivals in Palestine as part of the Zionist project. Native labor must not be exploited in the reconstruction of the country by the Jews. Jews must do everything themselves. The natives would continue to benefit indirectly from the general improvement and economic upsurge, particularly in trade. But henceforth Jews must try to be self-sufficient and do all the physical work with their hands, including the most difficult, the least paying, and the most menial. If there was no exploitation of Arab labor, Arab laborers could not objectively be opposed to the Zionists. Avoda ivrit was predicated in part upon a doctrinaire illusion, it was rampant with intellectual inconsistencies. In effect, it created a subculture, free from the demands of the larger society, not parasitic upon it, and above all, enjoying that kind of immunity from reality, whether Turkish, British, or Arab, that permitted its members to indulge in their dreams. The principal and direct benefit to the natives was the loss of their country, but Elon's point in general is a good one. Avoda Ivrit and the other Zionist devices for alienating the land from the natives allowed no one to say that there was an objective exploitation. Objective in this context takes on the most direct and cruelest meaning. It means, and meant, that Zionism would do its preparatory work and win its early battles objectively on its own ground, and not against anyone in this case, and henceforward, being defined as non-Jewish. Note that even Elon cannot see the moral distinction between British and Arab reality in Palestine. That by virtue of its unbroken existence in Palestine for centuries the native presence had and still has an incomparably greater moral authority than that of the imperial European power, has not occurred to him. And it did not always occur to the Zionists, who after 1948 did their best to eliminate objectively the Arab Palestinians. A typical view of what happened is Weizmann's remark that it was a miraculous cleaning of the land, the miraculous simplification of Israel's task. Thus all appeals on behalf of Zionism were international appeals perforce. The site of Zionist struggle was only partially in Palestine, most of the time until 1948, and even after, and Weizmann's own work is the best case in point, the struggle had to be waged, and fueled, and supplied, in the great capitals of the West. On the one hand, the native resistance to the Zionists was either played down or ignored in the West. On the other, the Zionists made it their claim that Britain was blocking their greater and greater penetration of Palestine. Between 1922 and 1947 the great issue witnessed by the world in Palestine was not, as a Palestinian would like to imagine, the struggle between natives and new colonists, but a struggle presented as being between Britain and the Zionists. The full irony of this remarkable epistemological achievement, and I use the philosophical term because there is no other one adequate to expressing the sheer blotting out from knowledge of almost 1 million natives, is enhanced when we remember that in 1948, at the moment that Israel declared itself a state, it legally owned a little more than 6% of the land of Palestine, and its population of Jews consisted of a fraction of the total Palestinian population. The consistency of this attitude and avoda ivrit is almost total. Address the world as the aggrieved, with Britain, a colonial power, as your enemy, ignore the natives, and have nothing said about them, so long, objectively, as you cannot be seen directly to be exploiting them. The diffusion of Zionism in the West, its subsequent replenishment by the West, was spearheaded obviously enough by the Jewish communities in the West. The essence of the Zionist campaign on behalf of the conquest of Palestine was, and remains to this day, an appeal so specific, yet so full of general justification, as to make all opposition to it both impossibly general and generally inadmissible. This had the effect of bringing most of the liberal and enlightened West to its side. Let me give a few examples of what I mean. As Herzl first conceived of it in the 90s, Zionism was a movement to free Jews and solve the problem of anti-Semitism in the West. Later elaborations of this idea took Palestine as the place where the conception was to be materially fulfilled, after locations in South America and East Africa had been considered and dropped. In addition to being the place where there existed a spiritual bond in the form of a covenant between God and the Jews, Palestine had the further advantage of being a backward province in an even more backward empire. Therefore, the effort of all Zionist apologetic from the beginning was to lay claim to Palestine both as a backward, largely uninhabited territory and as a place where the Jews, enjoying a unique historical privilege, could reconstitute the land into a Jewish homeland. Thus to oppose such an idea in the West was immediately to align oneself with anti-Semitism. To support it, on the other hand, was to do a number of far more interesting and acceptable things than merely displace or ignore a basically uninteresting bunch of resident natives. It was once again to solve a specific problem with a specific solution, a prospect, as we shall see, that bore within it not only the ideology of a constructive colonial adventure, but also the scientific, disciplined attitude of a positive social solution to a positive social and intellectual issue. Moreover, the idea of a Jewish state in, or a Jewish movement for, Palestine acquired a remarkable aura of moral prestige, the more so since the advent of fascism in Europe. Here was a people identified since ancient times with the land of Israel, identified also with a prodigious history of suffering, moral and intellectual grandeur, and, above all, with dispersion. Palestine was the specific and, it seemed, most liberal of all the answers to their needs. To oppose this plan, as I said above, was to find oneself with nowhere in the West to stand. This is still more or less true today. Zionism has always sought specific answers: immigration, hospitals, and, later, arms for its defense, money. These answers attract support, since their negation seems principally to be only a negation, and an abstract and general one to boot. Even George Antonius' great book made its argument the Arab awakening, not the Palestinian presence, which was to be understood, he said, in terms of the Arabization and the Islamization of the whole Near Orient. Anyone feeling doubts now and then about Zionist conquests in Palestine would inevitably have to face up to the fact that what he supported as a result was a general Arab and Islamic bloc. And this bloc, both in its amorphousness and dark abstraction, made more elegant and attractive the picture of a handful of European Jews hewing a civilization of sweetness and light out of the black Islamic Sea, at a reasonable distance from Europe. The Zionists occupied a place that made it possible to interpret Palestine and its realities to the West in terms that the West could understand and easily accept, specifically and generally. Conversely, the refusal to accept the Zionist argument left anyone in the West with the poorest of alternatives, being simply negative, anti-Semitic, or an apologist for Islam and the Arabs. In any of these cases, the alternative to Zionism is, as I said earlier, too general or too outrageous. By way of contrast, Zionism offered the neatness of a specific solution, or answer, to a specific problem. After all, who could say what the Arabs or Islam wanted, were about, or for? Even the putting of such a question made it possible then, and now, alas, to argue that the Arabs were a whole mass of generally unpleasant things, which when they were presented at all made for a chilling and frightening reception. The fact is that Arabs were always being represented, never able to speak for themselves. This plus, paradoxically, their more and more evident political visibility, is why they have been so overwhelmingly refused a decent place in actuality, even when they sit on the land. Today, for example, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, is recognized by over 100 nations, and of course by all Palestinians, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and yet neither the United States nor Israel concedes that the PLO represents Palestinians. On the contrary, Camp David specifically arrogated the right of Palestinian representation to the United States, Israel, and Egypt. In making Zionism attractive, that is, making it attract genuine support in the deepest sense, its leaders not only ignored the Arab, when it was necessary to deal with him, they made him intelligible, they represented him to the West as something that could be understood and managed in specific ways. Between Zionism and the West there was and still is a community of language and of ideology. So far as the Arab was concerned, he was not part of this community. To a very great extent this community depends heavily on a remarkable tradition in the West of enmity toward Islam in particular and the Orient in general. I have documented this tradition in detail elsewhere, and I refer my reader to my study of what I have called Orientalism for details and for an account of a long, consistent history which culminates today in the fact, for example, that practically the only ethnic group about whom in the West racial slurs are tolerated, even encouraged, is the Arabs. The Arabs in Islam represent viciousness, venality, degenerate vice, lechery, and stupidity in popular and scholarly discourse. On this collective representation of the Arabs and Islam, Zionism, like its Western ideological parents, drew. How it drew and where it stood when it drew deserve attention here, because it is a perfect instance of how propaganda, politicized scholarship, and ideological information have power, implement policy, and, at the same time, can appear to be objective truth. First of all, the Zionists took it upon themselves as a partially Eastern people who had emancipated themselves from the worst Eastern excesses, to explain the Oriental Arabs to the West, to assume responsibility for expressing what the Arabs were really like and about, never to let the Arabs appear equally with them as existing in Palestine. This method allowed Zionism always to seem both involved in and superior to the native realities of Middle Eastern existence. As an instance, consider this extraordinarily revealing letter of May 30, 1918, from Weizmann to Balfour. It is with a great sense of responsibility that I am attempting to write to you about the situation here and about the problems which confront the Zionist Commission. The Arabs, who are superficially clever and quick-witted, worship one thing, and one thing only, power and success. Hence, while it would be wrong to say that British prestige has suffered through the military stalemate, it certainly has not increased the British authorities. Knowing as they do the treacherous nature of the Arab, they have to watch carefully and constantly that nothing should happen which might give the Arabs the slightest grievance or ground of complaint. In other words, the Arabs have to be nursed lest they should stab the army in the back. The Arab, quick as he is to gauge a situation, tries to make the most of it. He screams as often as he can and blackmails as often as he can. The first scream was heard when your declaration was announced. All sorts of misinterpretations and misconceptions were put on the declaration. The English, they said, are going to hand over the poor Arabs to the wealthy Jews, who are all waiting in the wake of General Allenby's army, ready to swoop down like vultures on an easy prey and to oust everybody from the land. At the head of the administration we see enlightened and honest English officials, but the rest of the administrative machinery is left intact, and all the offices are filled with Arab and Syrian employees. We see these officials, corrupt, inefficient, regretting the good old times when bakshish was the only means by which matters administrative could be settled. The fairer the English regime tries to be, the more arrogant the Arab becomes. It must also be taken into consideration that the Arab official knows the language, habits and ways of the country, which isn't perhaps so unusual, since he is of the country, which is Arab after ale. Note how Weizmann makes it seem that the Arabs possess an unfair advantage by simply being there, is a roue and therefore has a great advantage over the fair and clean-minded English official, who is not conversant with the subtleties of the Oriental mind. So the English are run by the Arabs. The administration in this form is distinctly hostile to Jews. The Englishman at the head of affairs is fair and just, and in trying to regulate the relations between the two chief sections of the community, Arabs and Jews, to call them chief more or less equally is something of an exaggeration, yet Weizmann does it anyway. He is meticulously careful to hold the balance. But his only guide in this difficult situation is the democratic principle, which reckons with the relative numerical strength, and the brutal numbers operate against us, for there are 5 Arabs to 1 Jew. The present state of affairs would necessarily tend towards the creation of an Arab Palestine, if there were an Arab people in Palestine. Here Weizmann uses criteria for peoplehood especially designed in the 19th century to exclude African blacks and Latin American Indians from the right to resist white colonialists, who were people. It will not in fact produce that result because the fella is at least 4 centuries behind the times, and the effendi, who, by the way, is the real gainer from the present system, is dishonest, uneducated, greedy, and as unpatriotic as he is inefficient. Weizmann's candor is instructive. His principal rhetorical device is to identify himself with Balfour as a European who knows the difference between the Oriental and the Occidental mind. From this distinction all sorts of conclusions follow. Arabs are Oriental, therefore less human and valuable than Europeans and Zionists. They are treacherous, unregenerate, etc. Most of all, they do not deserve to own a country, even if their numerical advantage seems otherwise to entitle them to it. Weizmann essentially recapitulates John Stuart Mill's arguments on representative government, by which the Indians were denied the right to rule themselves because they were centuries behind the English. Thus the total identification of Zionism with the most reprehensible aspects of European white cultural and racial hegemony is easily made by Weizmann, as is the more useful identification of himself with the expert knowledge of the Orient usually reserved for Orientalists, Eastern experts, Arab bureau hands, and the like. The Zionist fuses with the white European against the colored Oriental, whose principal political claim seems only to be quantitative, his brute numbers, and otherwise lacking in quality, and the Zionist also, because he understands the Eastern mind from within, represents the Arab, speaks for him, explains him to the European. Both Zionist and European share in common the ideals of fair play, civilization, and progress, none of which the Oriental could understand. As Weizmann explains it, the conflict in Palestine is a struggle to wrest control of land from natives, but it is a struggle dignified by an idea, and the idea was everything. Secondly, Zionism's conflict with the Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere in the region was seen as extending, perpetuating, even enhancing, to the advantage of the West, the age-old conflict between the West and the Orient, whose main surrogate was Islam. This was not only a colonial matter, but a civilizational one as well. It was perfectly apparent to Western supporters of Zionism like Balfour that the colonization of Palestine was to be made a goal for the Western powers from the very beginning of Zionist planning. Herzl used the idea, Weizmann used it, every leading Israeli since has used it. Israel was a device for holding Islam, and later the Soviet Union, or communism, at bay. Zionism and Israel were associated with liberalism, with freedom and democracy, with knowledge and light, with what we understand and fight for. By contrast, Zionism's enemies were simply a 20th-century version of the alien spirit of Oriental despotism, sensuality, ignorance, and similar forms of backwardness. If they didn't understand the glorious enterprise that was Zionism, it was because they were hopelessly out of touch with our values. It did not seem to matter that the backward Muslim had his own forms of life, to which he was entitled as a human being, or that his attachment to the land on which he lived was as great as and perhaps even greater, by virtue of its investment in centuries of actual habitation, than that of the Jew who yearned for Zion in his exile. All that really mattered were ethnocentric ideals, appropriated by Zionism, valorizing the white man's superiority and his right over territory believed to be consonant with those ideals. How much these notions have become accepted ideas in the common discourse of enlightened American liberal democracy needs to be documented immediately and decisively. Each of the instances I will cite makes its point about Zionism and Israel in two related ways. One is that Zionism on its own merits is a marvelous, admirable thing which is accountable to no one and nothing, mainly because it corresponds so completely with Western ideas about society and man. The other is that the obstacles to Zionism and/or Israel are nefarious, stupid, or morally indecent, and, this is crucial, they are not to be heard from directly. Only Zionism can speak for them. Take Reinhold Niebuhr as a first case. So far as I know, he had little to do with the Arab world or Islam to begin with, except as he appropriated cultural ideas about them unquestioningly. Yet along with 6 other notables, Niebuhr signed a long letter to the New York Times on November 21, 1947, in support of the idea of partitioning Palestine. Here is the core of their argument. Politically, we would like to see the lands of the Middle East practice democracy as we do here. Socially and economically, we would want these lands to develop in a manner which would improve local conditions of life and open up both the resources and the markets of the region. In other words, however we look at it, American interests, seen from a long-range view, dictate speedy modernization of the Middle East in all the spheres of human endeavor. Whoever approaches the Middle East with even a minimum of objectivity has to admit that thus far there is only one vanguard of progress and modernization in the Middle East. Note here the appropriation of quasi-Marxist language to promote a fundamentally colonialist scheme, and that is Jewish Palestine. A second factor for progress is Christian Lebanon, which, at the moment, is artificially subdued by the pan-Arabists and pan-Islamists of the Arab League against the will and sentiments of Lebanon's Christian majority. But for these two islands of Western civilization, Jewish Palestine and Christian Lebanon, the Arab-Muslim Middle East presents a hopeless picture from an American viewpoint. Niebuhr's intellectual authority has been very great in American cultural life. What he says here, therefore, has the force of that authority. Yet to the Arab Palestinian, insofar as he is the object of that force, Niebuhr's remarks are nothing short of violent. We would like to see, and we would want for these lands, populated by millions of Muslim Arabs when Niebuhr spoke for them, suggests that what these lands want and wish are of little interest. Our wishes ought to override their wishes. Our wishes state by irreducible fiat that there is only one vanguard of progress, constituted by two tiny minorities, one imported, the other native. It never seemed to occur to the signatories of the letter that the wishes of the vast majority of the people of the Middle East were natural, and that the artificiality of which Niebuhr and his friends spoke could more properly be ascribed to the Zionists and the Maronites. And how unwittingly prescient of the later troubles in the region, to wit the problems of Israel and of civil war-torn Lebanon. These islands, had he been less disingenuous, Niebuhr ought to have called them colonies, mitigate the otherwise hopeless picture presented by the Muslim world. Hopeless for whom and for what? Niebuhr doesn't feel it necessary to say what should be evident to any civilized Westerner. Islam is the enemy of Judaism and Christianity, and therefore our policy ought to be to support Jewish Palestine and Christian Lebanon. That there might be real live people in the region for which Niebuhr speaks so imperiously is an unthought-of possibility. The ideological screen literally effacing them permits him to speak as he and his friends do. Zionism is progress and modernity, Islam and the Arabs are the opposite. Only Niebuhr can speak for all parties. We must not neglect to see a certain condescension even in the partisanship toward Palestinian Jews and Christian Lebanese. A year earlier, Niebuhr had written an article called A New View of Palestine for The Spectator. His inflections here were slightly more conciliatory, seeing as advice or criticism from an American on the Palestinian issue will hardly be welcome in Britain at the present time, the time in question being a crisis over the endless problem of limiting Jewish immigration into Palestine. Even so, Niebuhr feels it incumbent on him to offer if not advice then a new view, or at least a view that will be of help to the British. Unlike the letter in the New York Times, here he speaks directly to an imperial authority, as from one imperial agency to another. There is, I know, not sufficient consideration in America either of Arab rights or of the embarrassment of Britain in dealing with the Arab world. I find it baffling, on the other hand, that the average person here speaks of Arab opinion without suggesting that such opinion is limited to a small circle of feudal overlords, that there is no middle class in this world and that the miserable masses are in such abject poverty that an opinion is an impossible luxury for them. One difficulty with the Arab problem is that the technical and dynamic civilization which the Jews might have helped to introduce and which should have the support of American capital, and which would include river development, soil conservation and use of native power, would not be acceptable to the Arab chieftains though beneficial to the Arab masses. It would have therefore to be imposed provisionally, but would have a chance of ultimate acceptance by the masses. The Spectator, August 6, 1946, page 162. Whether before this piece was written or after it, Niebuhr could not have been found guilty of discussing, much less supporting, Arab rights. He simply never did. His opening sentence, therefore, is little more than a rhetorical ploy for making his main point, that Arab opinion doesn't count, for the bogus sociological reasons he gives, as if masses didn't also need some piece of land on which to conduct their ignorance, backwardness, and decadence. Even that is not his real intention, which is nothing more than saying that whether they have an opinion or not, Arabs ought not to be allowed to obstruct the technical and dynamic civilization being brought into Palestine by the European Jews. It might have been easier to make such a point if, for example, he could directly assert a. that Arabs are sui generis inferior and b. that they were simply the creatures, without will or opinion, of a hopelessly decadent, small, feudal class of overlords who manipulated the masses as so many puppets. Instead, Niebuhr chooses the more culturally valid form of statement and says that his argument in reality is being made not merely on behalf of the technical and dynamic civilization brought in by Zionism, but that it has the Arab masses in mind. Let us leave aside the fact that Niebuhr could have found many instances in recent Arab-Palestinian history of purely spontaneous mass uprising against Zionism, or that he could have found cases of Arab peasants turning in vain to the Zionist settlers for help against Arab absentee landlords. What he does not see, as Marx did not see 100 years earlier when he wrote about the British in India, is that there was a national right being violated even by a technical and dynamic civilization when it made colonial incursions upon the miserable masses. In addition, and from the viewpoint of a famous Christian theologian, one would have expected, and in later years, expected fruitlessly, some appreciation of the fact that for every Jewish immigrant coming into Palestine there was likely to be an Arab or Arabs displaced, and human rights accordingly suppressed. Finally, we would have expected Niebuhr to have made some effort to hear the miserable masses and their wishes, or at least to have assumed that among their more or less natural wishes would have been the desire not to be displaced or so violently benefited by a superior civilization. Had Niebuhr been speaking about the South African situation or about the American South, no such condescension and racial implications would have been tolerated, which is a situation the more to be appreciated when we realize, as I said above, that Niebuhr believes himself to be expressing an advanced, or progressive, liberal view. Well then, we ask, is it possible that Niebuhr did not know what was happening in Palestine, or, as I believe the case to be, that he truly thought that Zionism was culturally superior to Arab decadence? This brings me to my second example, which will illustrate the extent to which support for Zionism, in all its positive and affirmative aspects, entailed not just a grudging acceptance of some Arab reality in Palestine but an affirmative and positive feeling that Zionism had done well in destroying Arab Palestine. No less a spokesman and cultural status figure than Niebuhr, Edmund Wilson was also a remarkably brilliant and Catholic critic of literature, society, history, and morals. Much more than Niebuhr, he exemplified a lifelong project to discriminate between those elements in Western and world culture that were, the phrase is a bit mushy, but I use it sincerely, life-enhancing and those that were life-retarding. Whatever else he may have been, Wilson never identified with the state, or with anything the slightest bit chauvinistic, or even institutional. Any one of his readers, and he was the most widely read man of letters produced in this country, will know this about him. Wilson was particularly interested in the Jews, Hebrew, and the Old Testament. When he turned 60, he wrote in an essay on the Jews that the culture of no other people than the English, and then the American Puritans, seems so deeply to have been influenced by these, the phrases and visions of the Hebrew Bible, and his study of Hebrew as well as his book on the Dead Sea Scrolls testify to the special hold on him of the Jews and Judaism. One can have no problem with such an attitude, of course, except when Israel is in question. Black, red, blonde and olive includes a long, rambling section occasioned by Wilson's visit to Israel. The piece is episodic and given in diary form as a random sampling of his impressions in Israel, most of them triggered by his reading of Hebrew literature and his interest in Judaism. At one point, he comments on the terrorism by which the state came into being, and how there might have been something reprehensible about the whole business. He sees that terrorism was the result of the Nazi persecutions and of the policy of the British, but adds disapprovingly that in Israel the terrorist habit has been established and with it an element of moral fanaticism. Nevertheless, Wilson does pursue the matter far enough to remark that the Israelis, in relation to the Arabs, have shown certain signs of returning to the callous intolerance of the Israelites in relation to the people they dispossessed. About the fact of dispossession, Wilson appears to take no particular position, except as in the Bible, that it happened. This might suggest a certain historical neutrality on his part toward the occurrence of dispossessions here and there in the world, even though we cannot fail to remember that as he writes, Wilson is in a place where the dispossession and intolerance are actually happening. We realize that he is not speaking about the Bible when, a sentence or so later, he delivers the following description: so the position of the Arabs in Israel, especially as one sees them in the country, is rather like that fierce but still picturesque, pathetically retarded people, cut off from the main community but presenting a recurrent problem. In a large Arab town like Acre, the squalor of the swarming streets inspires in an Israeli the same distaste that it does in the visiting Westerner. For the Jew, who takes family relations so seriously and who, in Israel, has labored so carefully with the orphans from Poland and Germany, and the children of the illiterate Yemenites, the spectacle of flocks of urchins, dirty, untaught, diseased, bawling and shrieking and begging in the narrow and dirty streets, inspires even moral horror. If the restrictions imposed on marriage by the ancient rabbinical law are considered by many too rigid, the facility of divorce for the Arabs, which, together with their nomadic habits, encourages the father of a family simply to abandon his offspring and move on to take a woman in another place, must be felt to be an evil far worse. It is not that a certain contempt for the Arabs is not natural for anyone trained in the West, nor is it that any ruthlessness of Israel is not matched by the rather stupid obstinacy of the Arab refugees in Jordan, who have refused offers of UNRWA to accommodate them in other localities and continue to insist on returning to their villages and farms in Israel. I am occupied here solely with bringing out the operation in Israel of a certain Jewish tendency toward exclusiveness. I shall deal later on with the converse of this, the life-giving elements of the Jewish tradition, as a limiting and sometimes destructive influence. With regard to the Arabs that Wilson describes here, Jewish exclusiveness does not seem like much of an evil. In his brief portrait of them, the Arabs are seen as totally disgusting and unattractive. The reason for their poverty seems less important than its appearance, although the facts about Arabs in Israel would not have been hard for Wilson to get hold of. As for his remarks about the Arab and his sense of family, these can only be understood as one would understand remarks about Orientals not having the same regard for human life that we do. In other words, Arabs don't care for children, they don't feel love or anger, they are simply quick-breeding animals. The certain contempt felt for Arabs extends to finding the Arab Palestinian stupid in his obstinacy about being accommodated elsewhere, but the most maddening dishonesty is found in Wilson's use of the word exclusiveness to speak about Zionist treatment of the Arabs who did not leave until 1948. During the time that he was in Israel, the laws applied to Arabs were the emergency defense regulations originally devised and implemented in Palestine by the British to be used against the Jews and Arabs. These laws were openly racist in that they were never used in Israel against Jews. When Israel retained them after 1948 for use in controlling the Arab minority, they forbade Arabs the right of movement, the right of purchase of land, the right of settlement, and so forth. Under the mandate, the regulations were regularly denounced by the Jews as colonial and racist. Yet as soon as Israel became a state, those same laws were used against the Arabs. Wilson has nothing whatever to say about this. Again, there is little excuse for the omission since, as one can ascertain easily from Sabri Jurius' book The Arabs in Israel, there was a great deal of post-1948 Zionist writing against the abuses of the former colonial rules as they were administered by Israelis to suppress and manipulate the Arabs. Over and above everything explicit in Wilson's writing is the implicit verity, so it seems that anyone, especially an enlightened humanistic liberal, can write, have an expert opinion on, discourse about the situation in the Middle East. This is a very important thing, I think. For if during the 19th century the expert scholar Orientalist was looked to for knowledge about the Orient, the situation changed drastically in the 20th century. For now a Westerner turns for his evidence of and knowledge about the Orient and Orientals to the Zionist. What Wilson sees, and for that matter what the Westerner generally sees, in the Middle East is seen from the Zionist perspective. Israel is the norm, Israelis are the presence, their ideas and institutions the authentically native ones, Arabs are a nuisance, Palestinians a quasi-mythical reality, mainly, the argument goes, a propaganda reality, and so on. Israeli origins are forgotten, Israel simply is a Western democracy now quite gratuitously set upon by anti-Semitic Arabs. The reversal in actuality is complete. This is the greatest success of what I referred to earlier as the Zionist practice of diffusing truth. In other words, Wilson's remarks about the Arabs are not inaccurate. They are very accurate as a more or less verbatim copy of what Israelis, as Western colonialists living in a backward area, think about Arabs, their nomadic habits, and so forth. But the illusion is so complete that one forgets that the relationship between Israelis and Arabs is not a fact of nature but the result of a specific, continuing process of dispossession, displacement, and colonial de facto apartheid. Moreover, one tends to forget that Zionists were arrivals in Palestine from Europe. 3. The issue of representation. The point I have been trying to make is that such writing as Wilson's can be taken as the perfect symbol of a political reality in what I have been calling the common discourse of enlightened American liberal democracy. It is the complete hegemonic coalescence between the liberal Western view of things and the Zionist Israeli view. I use the word hegemonic advisedly, with all its resonances in Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist who analyzed the importance of culture and of intellectuals to politics. For in elaborating one of its meanings, Gramsci assigned the notion of consent to hegemony. In other words, there is hegemony not by mere domination but by consent, acquiescence. By the middle of the 20th century, as the examples of Niebuhr and Wilson show, there was a willing identification between Western liberal discourse and Zionism. The reasons for this identification are complex, perhaps there is even an acceptable justification for it, but for the Arab Palestinian the concrete meaning of this hegemonic relationship was disastrous. There are no two ways about it. The identification of Zionism and liberalism in the West meant that insofar as he had been displaced and dispossessed in Palestine, the Arab had become a non-person as much because the Zionist had himself become the only person in Palestine as because the Arab's negative personality, Oriental, decadent, inferior, had intensified. In Zionism, the liberal West saw the triumph of reason and idealism, and only that, because that is what liberalism wishes principally to see. In liberalism, Zionism saw itself as it wanted itself to be. In both cases, the Arab was eliminated, except as trouble, negation, bad values. This is surely a unique instance of ideology overriding simple economics. For to this day on purely economic grounds, and considering the vast amount of aid given to Israel and Zionism, Israel is a disaster, yet its triumph of pioneering reason justifies more and more aid, more and more affirmation, with the grounds for affirmation shrinking gradually. Niebuhr and Edmund Wilson date from the 40s and 50s, respectively. In the decade following the June 1967 war, Israel's borders expanded enormously. A large population of approximately 1 million Arabs was accumulated as a result. No one, least of all Israelis, could dodge the problem of this new Palestinian actuality. The word Arab no longer served to describe everyone who was not Jewish. There were the old Arabs in Israel, the new West Bank Gaza set, the militant liberation fighters, later the PLO, and the various communities scattered in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and the Arabian Gulf. For over 10 years now, Israel has been in military occupation of actual territories and people. It is true that the West Bank is designated as Judea and Samaria, but the people there will not be so easily dissolved, at least not yet. Therefore the new obstacle for Zionism liberalism is the problem of the occupation. Israel will have it that military occupation really means living together, a concept congenial enough to the New York Times on occasion as to warrant wholesale approval. On May 2, 1976, the paper's lead editorial denounced Arab propagandists for all sorts of abominations, chief among them, attacking the occupation of Arab territory, then, echoing the official Israeli line, proclaimed the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza as a model for future cooperation between Arabs and Jews in former Palestine. In no other context could such a statement be made. A military occupation was taken as representative of good relations between people, a scheme on which to build a common future, just as autonomy was supposed to be what the Arabs of Eretz Israel really wanted. Nor was this all. What we must again see is the issue involving representation, an issue always lurking near the question of Palestine. I said earlier that Zionism always undertakes to speak for Palestine and the Palestinians. This has always meant a blocking operation, by which the Palestinian cannot be heard from or represent himself, directly on the world stage. Just as the expert Orientalist believed that only he could speak, paternally as it were, for the natives and primitive societies that he had studied, his presence denoting their absence, so too the Zionists spoke to the world on behalf of the Palestinians. This has not everywhere and any time been possible, as every insurgent movement since World War II has learned to its advantage. In an age of mass and sometimes instant communication, sensational guerrilla or terrorist exploits can speak directly, can represent directly an otherwise blocked presence. In time, this repressed presence filters through, the more so, as was the case with most Israelis, when it is denied. In the final analysis, this latest denial of the Palestinians has turned out to be the greatest, but most inevitable, mistake made by Zionism since its inception. This is something I shall discuss in the next chapter. Here we should detail some recent instances of the hegemonic liberal Zionist union in order to complete the series of examples I began with Niebuhr and Wilson. It has been generally true, I think, that one almost infallible index of acceptability and political legitimacy in the United States is who speaks for what. One reason for the powerful, nonetheless highly selective, legitimacy of the NLF in this country was the spectrum of highly placed, highly visible, and otherwise prominent figures speaking against the U.S. enterprise in Vietnam. When Dr. Spock, Jane Fonda, Noam Chomsky, and Senator McGovern all condemn the same thing, they can be taken to be validating the opposite of what they condemn. Conversely, in the case of Israel, when speaking warmly for and on behalf of Israel is considered de rigueur for anyone in either public or intellectual life, the sheer impossibility of finding a space in which to speak for the Palestinians is enormous. Indeed, every statement on behalf of Israel intensifies and concentrates pressure on the Palestinian to be silent, to accept repression. Thus it is legitimate and acceptable to be for Israel and against the Palestinians. The more active principle stemming from this axiom is that you will very often find articles by Israelis about Israel in public circulation, but very rarely articles by Arabs about themselves. This is not only a gross numerical disproportion, which has a great deal to do with the difference in size and, yes, quality between the resident Arab and Jewish communities in this country, but also a qualitative one. During the 1973 war, for example, the New York Times Sunday magazine ran an essay one week by a prominent Israeli lawyer on what it felt like to be at war. The next week there was a supposedly symmetrical feature, although it was written by a former U.S. ambassador to Syria. When an Arab voice is heard, it is selected in such a way as to make the least impression, or, as I said earlier, when a representative Arab view is put forward, it is either by a Western expert or it is a quasi-official Arab statement. Quantity and quality are kept equivalent. During the decade after 1967, a great many well-known personalities visited Israel, and in the case of the writers among them, wrote their impressions. The most recent instance is Saul Bellow. Others include Stephen Spender, Francine Duplessis-Gray, Renata Adler, and Gary Wills. After 1967, unlike the period about which Edmund Wilson wrote, it was not possible to avoid or ignore the occupied territories or the Arabs there. Each account of a visit to Israel therefore includes something about the Palestinians. In each case, the Arabs are dealt with through an Israeli Arab expert, usually a worldly wise colonial officer, sometimes an academic figure with a background in military intelligence. In this respect, Bellow and Spender were exactly alike. Their liberal humanity, their concern for the possible violation of Israeli democracy by military occupation, was demonstrated by a talk with an expert who represented the Arab reality to them, alleviated their concern for humane values, and reassured them about Israeli democracy. In turn, this view of the Arab Palestinian inside the occupied territories came to stand for what the Arab Palestinian was, what he wanted, how he felt. It would be exactly like sending a white black affairs officer to tell a visiting Western intellectual what the South African black majority really was, really wanted, really felt. Only, of course, such a misrepresentation would be rejected as incredible. Bellow's To Jerusalem and Back gets its force precisely from this accepted, legitimated sort of representation. Not that there was no evidence about what was really happening inside Israel. Many Israelis visiting the United States have remarked on how the main difference between an Israeli and an American pro-Zionist is that the latter is a great deal less candid and open about Israel and its Arab problem than the former. For the cause of Israel and of Zionism in the United States, this is now less true of Europe, is virtually sacrosanct. The founding of Israel in 1948 is discussed with the same hushed breath and on the same high plane as the Marshall Plan. Whole segments of the intellectual and academic communities, to say nothing of the entire media industry, observe rituals about Israel and what it is all about that bear no comparison with any other cause. At the drop of a hat in 1974 and 1975, major figures in the arts, in public life, and in politics signed statements protesting Israel's expulsion, as it was called, from UNESCO and the United Nations condemnation of Zionism as a form of racism. Only occasionally did anyone, Noam Chomsky being the lone voice, so far as I have been able to determine, say anything about what has been and still was being done to the Palestinian Arab by Zionism and Israel, as the various practices discriminating against the non-Jew in Israel were indistinguishable from other forms of racial oppression elsewhere. Instead, one could watch Daniel Patrick Moynihan attacking villainy and defending freedom in the moral and intellectual vacuum reserved for Israel and Zionism. The sociology of what normally defines a cause, or perhaps what an issue must be in order to be a cause, breaks down completely in the case of Israel today, at least insofar as Israel is a subject of discussion or public debate. No liberal would be silenced from championing the cause of human rights in the Soviet Union, or Chile, or Africa. Yet when it comes to similar matters in Israel, there is an almost total silence. The subject of military government, its attendant abuses and human rights violations in Israel stubbornly resists any effort at making it a cause. This is particularly striking in cases when sources cited by the very few critics of Israel are Israeli sources. For years now, the Israeli League of Human Rights has been diffusing information on such matters as the demolition of Arab houses, the expropriation of Arab lands, the treatment of Arab workers, torture and illegal detention of Arabs, all cases documented principally by translations of articles in Israeli journals and newspapers. None of these items ever sees the light of day in the United States, and not for want of their being sent to editors, television columnists, prominent and, usually, outspoken liberals, etc. There are literally tens of Israeli news services, liberal newsletters, and liberal quarterlies regularly covering treatment of Arab Palestinians both inside pre-1967 Israel and in the occupied territories, to say nothing of United Nations reports, accounts written by former UN border and armistice supervisors, reports of international agencies like Amnesty International, the Red Cross, dozens of Arab and Arab American studies, none of which is ever released for wide distribution and dissemination in the United States. The most recent, and in many ways the most outlandish, such deliberate act of omission concerns the London Sunday Times Insight Report on Torture in Israel, June 19, 1977. Using an exhaustive series of investigative techniques, the Times revealed that torture of Arabs is a regular, methodical, and officially sanctioned device in Israel. That hundreds of Arabs are being detained and tortured, that the evidence is wholly convincing that the state condones the practice as a way of intimidating, controlling, and terrorizing the native population in the occupied territories. With only one known exception, the Boston Globe, not a single major American newspaper, or journal, weekly news magazine, or television news program, carried the report, most of them scarcely even mentioned it, and not one has mentioned the various Amnesty, Red Cross, and other such reports that followed. Of this scandalous informational dereliction, Nicholas von Hoffman aptly noted, at the minimum, the Israeli authorities should study the case assembled against them by the Sunday Times report on torture by Israeli authorities, and come up with something more convincing than the statement released by their embassy in London, which simply said, "Allegations of this nature have been repeatedly put out by Arab propaganda sources in recent years and proved to be totally unfounded in the light of detailed and documented investigations." Name-calling and reliance on investigations conducted by Israel for its own exoneration will not do. The grotesque irony of using gas as an instrument of torture ought to have been too much even for those Israeli officials who believe treating human beings this way advances the cause of democracy. Most Americans will never know any of this. As of now, only one newspaper, the Boston Globe, has seen fit to run the report. The indifference isn't owing to doubt about the caliber of the journalism. The Sunday Times Insight team which did the story is universally respected in the business. The lack of interest on this occasion may be explained by the New York Times covering the torture investigation with an 86-word article appearing on page 13. To some extent, all news in America is what the New York Times calls news, but even more so with foreign news, so few print or broadcast editors are able to make independent judgments on the news. They simply lack the character and stature to have an opinion of their own and prefer the safety of letting the nation's most prestigious paper do their decision-making for them. This is particularly easy with an issue like Israel, where any adverse publicity is likely to win an editor vociferous abuse from the nation's best organized lobby. It doesn't work that way abroad, however, where the mass media are giving the publics and the other democracies far less biased accounts. In the event that an occasional report or column, such as von Hoffman's, gets published or gets a little attention, its rarity and isolation, which comes from the absence of a context or tradition to set it in, drain it of any effectiveness. The power of a consensus, of a tradition, of a coherent discourse such as exists between Israel and liberal opinion, is that its sheer institutional presence dispels any evidence to the contrary, flicks it away as irrelevant. More, it can convert what one would expect to be devastating challenges to it into support for it. Take as the most recent instance the election of Menachem Begin. For years and years, Begin has been known as a terrorist and has made no effort to hide the fact. His book The Revolt is to be found in any university or medium-sized public library as part of the standard Middle East collection. In this book, Begin describes his terrorism, including the wholesale massacre of innocent women and children, in righteous and chilling profusion. He admits to being responsible for the April 1948 massacre of 250 women and children in the Arab village of Deir Yassin. Yet a few weeks after his election in May 1977, he emerged in the press with his terrorism forgotten, as a statesman with implied comparison to Charles de Gaulle. Here one cannot say that evidence of Begin's terrorism had been suppressed. It was there, has always been there in front of anyone discussing modern Israel, and has regularly been cited, in distinctions made, for example, between Begin and, say, David Ben-Gurion or Golda Meir, who were supposed to be statesmanlike. Yet so strong is the consensus decreeing that Israel's leaders are democratic, Western, incapable of evils normally associated with Arabs and Nazis, which, after all, Israel is supposed by its existence to have negated, that even a morsel as normally indigestible as Begin has been transmuted into just another Israeli statesman, and given an honorary LLD by Northwestern University in 1978 and part of a Nobel Peace Prize to cap it all. Precisely those liberals who discover causes and outrages everywhere simply have nothing to say about Begin, about torture in Israel, or about the literally unstoppable annexationist policies of the Israeli state. Much the same is true about the Palestinians as refugees. There is some dispute about how many Palestinians were forced out of their country and off their land during 1948. The figures range between 500,000 and 800,000. Even Israeli sources dispute the numbers but not the exodus itself, yet there is total agreement now that refugees exist. Almost 30 years of existence away from their territory, as well as the absence for them of the right of self-determination, prove, the word is unfortunate when its human meaning in this context is seen for what it is, some measure of injustice done them. But when one asks by whom or what they were made refugees, when the question of agency is posed, Israel is not only seen as exempt from blame or responsibility, according to President Carter for one, who similarly absolved the United States of responsibility for the devastation of Indochina, Israel, like the United States, is praised for its humanity. We are told that the Palestinians were in exchange for the Jews who left the Arab countries to come to Israel, that they left in spite of Haganah urgings that they not leave, that those who stayed are better off than their brethren in surrounding Arab countries, that there is only one haven for Jews and there are 20-odd for Arabs, and why can't Arabs be like Jews and take in their own refugees? That the occupation of more Palestinian territory in 1967 produced in fact a binational existence between Arab and Jew, that the West Bank occupation is a fulfillment of biblical prophecies, that there is a Palestine, and that it is in Transjordan, that other refugees, from Muslim India, from Nazi Germany, have resettled elsewhere, and why don't the Palestinians understand this? That the Palestinians are simply a political pawn, or football, used by the Arab regimes, and therefore do not really pose a problem once those regimes are made to see that they cannot get away with such tactics indefinitely. All this of course simply moves around the issue, which seems to have been converted into powerful evidence for Zionism's morality and high standards of conduct. 4. Palestinian rights. But here, as with most of the other matters in the question of Palestine, we need to connect things with each other, and see them, not as they are hidden. No evidence I cite here and elsewhere is arcane or obscure. Most of it is to be found in easily available documents, but as they are ignored or denied. The proper context for dealing with the refugee problem is ready at hand. Do the Palestinian refugees want to be repatriated, or compensated, or resettled elsewhere? Second, is there international and moral consensus on the theoretical as well as the practical answers to these questions? Third, what mechanism is there in Israel for making European and American Jews into immigrants, then citizens, and how does this mechanism prevent Arab Palestinian refugees from benefiting themselves? The answers to all of these questions are moral, of course, but they are interesting and important because of their political reality. These are not academic questions, in other words, but questions that bear directly upon the lives of millions of people, upon states, upon the international order. Let us review these questions dispassionately now. Before 1948, the majority of the territory called Palestine was inhabited beyond any doubt by a majority of Arabs, who after Israel came into being were either dispersed, they left, or were made to leave, or were enfolded within the state as a non-Jewish minority. After 1967, Israel occupied more Arab Palestinian territory. As a result, there are at present three types of Arab Palestinians: those inside pre-1967 Israel, plus those inside the occupied territories, plus those elsewhere outside former Palestine. There has never been a plebiscite conducted among Palestinians as to their wishes. There are obvious reasons for it: the sheer fact of their greatly complicated and dispersed presence under several jurisdictions, the political impossibility of conducting such a plebiscite, especially in countries under whose auspices no elections are held anyway. The list of reasons can be extended, and all of them add up to the insuperable difficulty at present of conducting such a plebiscite. Nevertheless, this is not to say that there are no other means by which, even in their dispersion and exile, the Palestinians could have expressed themselves. Judging by the great popular appeal and legitimacy of the Palestine Liberation Organization, by the constant resistance to and refusal of Israeli military rule in the occupied territories, by the daily demonstrations, strikes, and political gestures of resistance there and among the Arabs inside pre-1967 Israel, by every mass and private organization created by and for Palestinians, there is ample evidence to show that taken all together as members of a community whose common experience is dispossession, exile, and the absence of any territorial homeland, the Palestinian people has not acquiesced in its present lot. Rather, the Palestinians have repeatedly insisted on their right of return, their desire for the exercise of self-determination, and their stubborn opposition to Zionism as it has affected them. This Palestinian insistence is no unique, decontextualized aberration. It is fully supported by every international legal and moral covenant known to the modern world. Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, stipulates that 1. Everyone has a right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. 2. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, further affirms these fundamental rights of people and, since 1976, has been accepted as a document carrying the unique force of a unanimous United Nations General Assembly vote, with only 5 abstentions. Its Article 12 states, 2. Everyone shall be free to leave any country, including his own. 3. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. In addition, the UN Commission on Human Rights asseverates that everyone is entitled, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, marriage or other status, to return to his country. B. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality or forced to renounce his nationality as a means of divesting him of the right to return to his country. c. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. d. No one shall be denied the right to return to his own country on the ground that he has no passport or other travel document. Most arguments attempting to refute these, to Palestinians at least, clear determinations have concentrated on a limited set of arguments. If the Palestinians left in 1948, we are told, they did so because the Arab states urged them to do so in order that after a boasted victory, they could return in triumph. My own experience and all the evidence suggests that the conclusive reason for the Arab-Palestinian exodus in 1948 was a different one. But so far as the true argument about Palestinian right of return is concerned, the reason for the flight of the Palestinians is finally irrelevant. What matters is that they are entitled to return, as international law stipulates, as numerous United Nations resolutions, voted for by the United States, have averred, and as they themselves have willed. The first UN General Assembly Resolution, No. 194, affirming the right of Palestinians to return to their homes and property, was passed on December 11, 1948. It has been repassed no less than 28 times since that first date. Whereas the moral and political right of a person to return to his place of uninterrupted residence is acknowledged everywhere, Israel has negated the possibility of return, first by a series of laws declaring Arab-owned land in Palestine absentee property, and hence liable to expropriation by the Jewish National Fund, which legally owns the land in Israel for the whole Jewish people, a formula without analogy in any other state or quasi-state, and second by the law of return, by whose provision any Jew born anywhere is entitled to claim immediate Israeli citizenship and residence, but no Arab can, even if his residence and that of his family for numerous generations in Palestine can be proved. These two exclusionary categories systematically and juridically make it impossible, on any grounds whatever, for the Arab Palestinian to return, be compensated for his property, or live in Israel as a citizen equal before the law with a Jewish Israeli. Another argument is that if so many basically hostile Palestinians were to be allowed to return, what would happen to Israel would be, in fact, political suicide. Moreover, Israel is a state for Jews, and they must always be allowed the infinitely open option of a potential return to Zion. Both these arguments have the force, indeed the conviction and intensity, of genuine passion. It is useless for a Palestinian Arab to deny them, just as it is useless to imagine that Israeli Jews would be likely ever to want to return to their places of origin. Much of the despair and pessimism that one feels at the whole Palestinian-Zionist conflict is each side's failure in a sense to reckon with the existential power and presence of another people with its land, its unfortunate history of suffering, its emotional and political investment in that land, and worse, to pretend that the other is a temporary nuisance that, given time and effort, and punitive violence from time to time, will finally go away. The actuality is that Palestinian and Israeli Jews are now fully implicated in each other's lives and political destinies, perhaps not in any ultimate way, which is a subject not easily bracketed in rational discussion, but certainly now and in the foreseeable future. Yet even so, one must be able to discriminate between an invading, dispossessing, and displacing political presence and the presence it invades, displaces, and dispossesses. The two are not equal, nor in the end is one ever going to prevail over and definitively dominate the other. For Zionism to perpetuate a political, juridical, and epistemological system whose immediate and constantly renewed and even long-term goal is to keep Palestine and the Palestinians out, is therefore something, I believe, to be opposed and subject to serious analysis. What is the meaning and the form of such opposition? Because of the political and epistemological circumstances that I have been describing, to oppose anything about Israel and Zionism is to seem to be advocating anti-Semitism at least, and genocide at most. Of course, to draw such conclusions out of what I hope to show is a principled and discrete platform of opposition, is to do a mischievous and destructive thing, but it is done anyway, and will continue to be done, alas, for years to come. Yet the whole point of rational discussion, in which I strongly believe, is to attempt to change the terms and the perspectives in which insoluble appearing problems are understood, and Israelis and the Palestinians together constitute such a problem, and together also require such a rational change. A perfect opportunity for change was at hand when the Soviet Union and the United States issued their joint declaration on October 1, 1977. The notable thing about the declaration was that it spoke of Palestinian rights, and not merely interests, as something to be discussed in any final peaceful settlement of the Middle Eastern problem. The chorus of abuse and hysteria greeting that declaration from organized Jewish opinion was disheartening. Not only was the domestic Jewish-American reaction abusive, it was proudly so, as Jewish leaders boasted of having inundated the White House with thousands of letters and phone calls. The intended lesson was that any perceived threat to Israel, and any perceived deviation from an expected U.S. government line of unconditional acceptance of everything done by Israel, would totally mobilize every Jew and every Israeli supporter against the administration. The meaning of such intimidation is to keep the Middle East as a domestic, and not merely a foreign policy, issue. The other meaning, however, is that it is easy to mobilize people on the basis of fear. One wonders nevertheless whether fear, repression, and outright intellectual terrorism are warranted, or whether they serve an almost incredibly short-sighted and finally unintelligent interest. Are the only alternatives to discussion of the Palestinians a threat of what amounts to civil war between the American Jewish community and the administration, and what has been frequently described in the press by Israeli and U.S. officials as a potential war of annihilation waged by Israel against the Arabs? See, for example, Jim Hoagland in The Washington Post, October 26, 1977. What is the fearful thing provoking so violent a reaction and, more important, can it be made to disappear either by threats of war or war itself? To speak of the Palestinians rationally is, I think, to stop speaking about war or genocide and to start to deal seriously with political reality. There is a Palestinian people, there is an Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands, there are Palestinians under Israeli military occupation, there are Palestinians, 650,000 of them, who are Israeli citizens and who constitute 15% of the population of Israel, there is a large Palestinian population in exile. These are actualities which the United States and most of the world have directly or indirectly acknowledged, which Israel too has acknowledged, if only in the forms of denial, rejection, threats of war, and punishment. The history of the past 40 years has shown that Palestinians have grown politically, not shrunk, under the influence of every kind of repression and hardship. The history of the Jews has shown too that time only increases attachment to the historically saturated land of Palestine. Short of complete obliteration, the Palestinians will continue to exist and they will continue to have their own ideas about who represents them, where they want to settle, what they want to do with their national and political future. To criticize Zionism now, then, is to criticize not so much an idea or a theory but rather a wall of denials. It is to say firmly that you cannot expect millions of Arab Palestinians to go away, or to be content with occupation, or to acquiesce to an Israeli, or an Egyptian, or an American idea for their destiny, their autonomy, or their physical location. It is also to say that the time has come for Palestinians and Israeli Jews to sit down and discuss all the issues outstanding between them, rights of immigration, compensation for property lost, and so on, all in the context of a general discussion of future peace, and all too in the intellectual context of a Zionist acceptance of the fact that Jewish national liberation, as it is sometimes called, took place upon the ruins of another national existence, not in the abstract. It is finally to recognize that the question of Palestine is not simply a hermetic debate between Zionists as to how Zionism and Israel are to comport themselves in theory on the land of what once was Palestine, but a vital political matter involving Arabs and Jews, residents in a commonly significant territory. In all this discussion, however, one must remember that the issues are perceived and formulated not strictly as local issues between people in the Middle East but, as I have tried to show, as issues involving two communities who consider themselves in exile, communities whose quarrel has engaged the world internationally. The parties are Zionism, the Jewish covenant and Jewish history, the survivors of the most tragic destiny meted out to any people, and, on the other hand, an anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist third world people whose basis for action includes their own dispossession as a people as well as their opposition to racial discrimination, territorial expropriation, and military occupation. These universal matters lock the whole world into some aspect of the struggle, and even though there is always a danger that small quarrels magnified become intractable, it is true that magnification gives one some sense of the whole set of problems and ideas animating a dispute. But there must be a scaling down of this perhaps too imponderable contest. My belief is that both Palestinians and Jews in Palestine have much to gain, and obviously something to lose, from a human rights view of their common situation, as opposed to a strictly national perspective on it. It is too often forgotten that the modern Middle East has almost unquestioningly inherited a terribly divisive political legacy from 19th-century colonialism. The Ottoman Empire, as well as those portions of it that came under Western suzerainty, was ruled in principle by minorities whose local interest allied them with the colonial power. Today there are minority governments in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Israel, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. The regional majority is Sunni Islam, although each of these countries is governed either by a non-Sunni group or by a family and/or regional oligarchy not open to the population as a whole. As a result, central state governments in the area are essentially repressive toward the majority people, and this is manifestly true not only in Arab states, but also in Israel. The minority cast of mind, in association with an uncritical admiration of the state for its own sake, has made the lot of the individual citizen a precarious one. In Israel, for example, the state is divided into Jews and non-Jews, and even more discriminately into European and Oriental Jews. Elsewhere in the region, citizens' rights are dependent not on the guarantee of law but on the discretion of a jealously guarded central state power. Therefore, a move towards some equity in, as well as some solution for, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute would be to reconsider the problem between the two groups, to reformulate it as a dispute involving people who hope for the time when rights would be guaranteed for all the proper inhabitants, past and present, of the territory. At such a time, Israel could no longer be the state of the whole Jewish people resident there or not, but the state of its present Jewish and non-Arab citizens. The same would be true of the other states in the region. But even so basic a step is practically impossible at this time. The relations between Israelis and Palestinians are so inflamed as to make anything resembling equity and resolution out of the question. But only for the time being. The long-run goal is, I think, the same for every human being, that politically he or she may be allowed to live free from fear, insecurity, terror, and oppression, free also from the possibility of exercising unequal or unjust domination over others. This long-run goal has different meanings for the Palestinian Arabs and for the Israeli Jews. For the latter, it means freedom from the awful historical pressure of anti-Semitism whose culmination was Nazi genocide, freedom from fear of the Arabs, and freedom also from the blindness of programmatic Zionism in its practice against the non-Jew. For the former, the long-run goal is freedom from exile and dispossession, freedom from the cultural and psychological ravages of historical marginality, and freedom also from inhuman attitudes and practices toward the oppressing Israel. How does one think through the present obstacles to these long-range goals? The first, perhaps very small, step is an attempt at understanding. I said above that Zionism has been studied and discussed as if it concerned Jews only, whereas it has been the Palestinian who has borne the brunt of Zionism's extraordinary human cost, a cost not only large, but unacknowledged. Therefore it behooves one now to try to come to terms with Zionism as a theory, ideology, program of historico-political action with definite consequences for Palestinian Arabs, as well as for Israeli and other Jews. Once that reality is admitted into debate and rational understanding, then we can begin to understand also what enlivens Arab life. In other words, my aim here will be to open the discussion of the question of Palestine to a much denied, much suppressed reality, that of the Palestinian Arabs, of whom I myself am one. As first steps go, this is perhaps not as modest and academic as it may initially seem. The premise of my discussion will be that as much as in Palestine itself as in debate about Palestine, no serious attention has been paid to the full human reality of the Palestinian Arab as a citizen with human rights, someone who is not merely a symbol of the intractable, anti-Semitic terroristic refugee. Providentially, however, there has been no previous occasion when such a discussion could have been fruitful, let alone possible. But with a conciliatory mood appearing intermittently to prevail, although more war and more senseless talk about a peace process are equally real now, the necessity for a widespread grasp of the issues seems imperative. In the pages that follow I propose a two-part attempt at comprehension. First, in Chapter 2, a consideration of Zionism as it has affected the Palestinian Arab who was not its beneficiary but its victim. Then, in Chapter 3, a descriptive analysis of modern Palestinian experience, including the contemporary actuality of corporate Palestinian life, culture, political and social institutions. Chapter 4 will conclude with discussion of present and past United States policy toward the Middle East, and also a consideration of the problems to be confronted should the processes of peace finally begin in earnest for the Palestinians.